Good morning, friends, and that is to my friends in the UAE, and good day to listeners from other parts of the world. Our topic in our COVID webinar today is COVID variants, and added on is the travails of global travel. Now, I was just reading that very interesting introduction to the webinar today, and it says that the virus changes over time through mutation. Most mutations have little impact. However, some mutations increase the virus's capacity to spread, and some increase its severity. To talk about the various virus mutations, including the two most recent ones that we hear about, the Delta and the Omicron, is Professor Gottfried Menezes. Now, Dr. Menezes has appeared on our show earlier, and I thank him very much. Thank you, Dr. Gottfried, for coming on again today. As you can see, Professor Menezes has a PhD in medical microbiology, which he got in 2011. He is a member of the Indian Association of Medical Microbiologists, the Association of Medical and Biomedical Researchers, the Emirates Society of Clinical Microbiology, and of course, the International Association. He has more than 20 years of professional working experience, working in several reputable institutions in several parts of the world, including at Erasmus in the Netherlands, the University of Saudi Arabia, the Hale University of Saudi Arabia, and currently he is with us in our RAC Medical and Health College next door, the RAC Medical Health Sciences University in Ras Al Khaimah. He has more than 50 research publications. What Dr. Gottfried has to say about the various mutations of the COVID-19. And as I understand it, there is the Alpha, the Beta, the Gamma, the Delta, and Omicron. However, I am no expert in the subject, and I hand you over to Professor Gottfried Menezes.
Yeah, good morning, Professor Kennedy, Dr. Wilco, and all the audience session. Dr. Wilco, would you please help me share the screen?
Yes,
it's disabled. It's disabled.
Doc, please check.
Yeah. Are you able to see my slide, Dr. Wilco?
Yes, Doc.
Yes,
Clear.
okay, yeah, all right. Yeah, so I thank the management for this wonderful opportunity of RAC Hospital. The topic of my presentation is SARS-CoV-2 variants. I guess it is a much awaited topic. There's lots of talks happening about the variants and a lot of confusion regarding the variants. I have no relevant disclosures to this presentation. Yeah, so of late we have been complacent regarding the pandemic, and the 5 reasons not to let our guard down, mainly because of not enough people have been vaccinated yet, and most children won't get vaccinated for a while. Newer variants of the coronavirus are spreading, and Omicron is an evidence for that. Loosening pandemic restrictions all over the globe, and people are starting to travel again. The outline of the presentation includes mainly about the SARS-CoV-2 variants, including the Delta Plus, the genetic distance of the Omicron variant from the other variants, about the effectiveness of current treatments available, finally take-home message. Yeah, so a couple of statements to reflect upon or to introspect. ADE in COVID-19, antibody-dependent enhancement in COVID-19. What is Omicron variant? Why booster doses are important globally? Causative agents in co-infections and secondary infections, which are mostly responsible for death in COVID subjects. Can Omicron outcompete Delta? Is Omicron a common cold-causing variant rather than a killer virus? When you say killer virus, it refers to the Delta Plus variant. Is booster vaccine tailored specifically for Omicron variant underway? And is it required? Impact of Omicron variants on monoclonal antibody treatment. We have heard about several fancy named monoclonal antibodies. Are they still effective or not? And impact of Omicron variants on diagnosis. When you say there are several mutations, does it interfere with the molecular diagnosis, mainly the real-time PCR? These are the different abbreviations used. COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, ACE2, RBD, receptor binding domain, ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement, QRT-PCR, which is real-time quantitative PCR, Omicron, which is a Pango lineage, as well as TAG-VE, the agency which advisory board, which names the newer variants and the monoclonal antibody. Yeah, so it's not at all comforting to hear about infection control or antimicrobial resistance or pandemics, preventive measures, but we've got to deal with it and overcome this pandemic over the time. Yeah, so this is the latest stats of COVID-19 as on 9th December. We see that the numbers are ever increasing, and the most interesting factor seems to be South Africa, where the vaccination hasn't been much. And we have seen earlier that there were a lot of deaths reported in South Africa. And of late, we hear about Omicron variant spreading all across Europe, and not only Europe, all over the globe. So the main reason happens to be not enough people having been vaccinated. Whereas the countries with the lesser population like UAE with the stringent precautions and the nationwide vaccination programs has done a really good job in containing the virus. But I prefer to talk in terms of global data rather than just the local data. In terms of situation by WHO region, Americas, Europe, and Southeast Asia has always struggled to keep the cases down. The earlier presentation, my earlier talk was on November 28th, And when I was trying to update this particular slide, I thought, why not compare what happened in the last 13 days? So in last 13 days, we see that there have been enough number of cases and a lot of deaths as well, around close to 89,000 deaths. So we should not forget that though Omicron is a subject of talk these days, the deaths are mainly because of still Delta Plus. So Delta Plus is still in the picture, and Omicron happens to be the news of late. In the last 7 days, the deaths have been around 51,000, which is mostly seen in US, Russia, and India, followed by most of the countries in the European continent, except for Brazil, Vietnam, and Philippines. Yeah, so the total deaths all over the globe, these are the 20 countries which have documented maximum deaths. And in the new deaths as on December 10th is just around 1,000. I'm saying just around 1,000 because we have seen more than 100,000 deaths per day globally in the earlier period. When it comes to COVID-19 fatality rate by age, again, we see that the elderly who are above 80 years are almost like 14.8%, almost 15% more at risk in developing TBD. And among the comorbidities or underlying conditions, the most important one is cardiovascular disease, followed by equal contribution of diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, hypertension, cancer, and even when there are underlying conditions, people do suffer from, fatal incidences, mainly because of cytokine storm. So among the coronaviruses, we have seen that SARS-CoV-2 managed to be highly transmissible and also responsible for a pandemic because of highly transmission possibilities. Regarding the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, it is composed of two subunits, sub S1 and S2. The S1 subunit contains the receptor binding domain, which mainly is responsible for binding to host receptor, whereas S2 subunit mediates viral cell membrane fusion. We have seen this receptor being present in various organs, and this explains the broad expression of ACE2 for multi-organ injury during COVID-19. Yeah, so many people tend to ask about what is the best method to detect neutralizing antibodies. Overall, it is important to investigate host virus interactions, neutralizing antibodies, and immune response, which overall explains what could be the best therapeutic agent. And regarding the technique, it is mostly advanced flow cytometry platform and not the regular kind of test which could be useful for neutralizing antibodies. All these tests requires sort of automated or advanced flow cytometry platforms. Yeah, we know that the first line defense is the neutralizing antibodies, which tends to wane, which tends to decrease over the time beyond 3 months or more, or sometimes beyond 6 months, we see the decrease in neutralizing antibodies being observed. And nevertheless, there is second line defense by the CMI, cell-mediated immunity, as T-cell immunity appears preserved across several variants. Even if there are variants, still it appears to be working, and T-cell antigenic peptides appear less prone to mutation. ADE, that is antibody-dependent enhancement, explains why a time lag is required between vaccination, second dose and then the booster dose, or first dose and the second dose. Or if you're infected, why you need to wait for a while to get infected, to get vaccinated after infection, a time lag for vaccination. The reason is that it is attributed to ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement. So COVID-19 pandemic has raised concern about the detrimental effects of antibodies. So this is seen not only in COVID-19, even in dengue and other infections like respiratory viruses, respiratory syncytial virus, or measles virus. So ADE of infection is one of the biggest concern, not only in terms of antibody reactions to SARS-CoV-2 upon reinfection with the virus, but also the reaction to COVID-19 vaccine. So this explains why there needs to be a time lag between the vaccination or vaccination after infection. The existing evidence suggests that immune complex formation, complement deposition, and local immune activation are the most likely mechanisms of ADE in COVID-19 immunopathology. So among the co-infections, it's been mostly the seasonal respiratory viruses, whereas secondary infections are mainly because of bacteria or fungal agents, which are mostly seen in severely ill hospitalized subjects. And bacterial and fungal infections are almost 10 times more in such subjects who are hospitalized. We have heard enough about the earlier variants, which is alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And also we did have other variants of interest. At the moment, when we talk about deaths, it is not only attributed to one variant, it could be attributed to 7 different variants. So WHO is currently tracking 7 different variants: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, omicron, and the 2 variants of interest, lambda and mu. So variants of concern are mainly because of one of these consequences: increase in transmissibility or increase in virulence, decrease in effectiveness of public health measures, whereas variants of interest are still under study to find out if they can become variants of concern. We have seen that within 2 to 3 months, we have newer variants circulating, mainly because not enough vaccination has been done globally. More the chances of infections, you see newer variants. So Delta Plus, the most important mutation in this variant was K417N, which was responsible mainly for immune evasion and also reducing the effectiveness of existing monoclonal antibodies. And this was thought to be a reason for new wave, and it has managed to an extent in different parts of the world. And of late, on November 26th, Omicron became official. So it's been named Omicron, though it was thought to be named as New. New and Z Greek alphabets were left out, mainly because New sounds like a new variant, and Z because of family name of certain countries like China. So we need to keep our eye on Omicron, but our immediate concern is still Delta, because Delta is the one which is responsible for deaths worldwide. It's still causing significant amount of illness, particularly among the unvaccinated. So though it was mainly reported from Africa to begin with, as of now, it's been reported from 57 nations. So regarding the genetic distance of Omicron variant, we see that it is quite genetically distant from other variants. Though it is genetically distant, the good news is that Omicron still uses ACE2 receptor to enter and infect cells. So that part of it has not changed, luckily. So the S protein characterized of Omicron has at least 30 different amino acids, 30 amino acid substitutions, and out of these 30, 15 substitutions are in the receptor binding domain of spike protein. We see that these are the different amino acid substitutions which have been named. Out of them, the N501Y increases binding of the ACE2 receptor, which could increase transmission. So this explains why Omicron could be more transmissible more than Delta plus. So the relationship between Delta and Omicron, Delta not only proved to be more transmissible, but also to cause even more severe illnesses compared to the previous strains, previous variants of the virus. Whereas the vaccines greatly reduce severe disease and death of Delta variant, when it comes to Omicron, it's able to reinfect people more readily than the earlier variants, mainly because of the mutations. And though it is mild, as of now observed to be mild, variant appears to be spreading more than twice as quickly as Delta. So it's even more transmissible, twice as quickly as Delta. Omicron variant, according to preliminary information from South Africa, we have seen that there are no unusual symptoms. And similar to the earlier strains, there are also asymptomatic individuals, which seems to be the matter of worry because they can spread infection without knowing that they're infected, and others will not be knowing. And as of now, the infection has been mostly among university students, who seems to be younger individuals naturally, who tend to have more mild disease. So we are yet to see the effect of this Omicron variant among vulnerable people or elderly people. So the key happens to be prevention rather than trying out and waiting for the situation to worsen. So what have been the main symptoms as of now out of Omicron variant? It has been mild, as said in the earlier slide. And among the symptoms, they could be fever or persistent cough or loss of smell of sensation. So it has been mostly sort of endemically getting transmitted. It has turned more of an endemic kind of the disease, but because of travel across the globe, it is spreading also globally. And whenever there are increasing number of cases, it gets an golden opportunity to increase, chances of mutations. So among the mutations, some of them may make them into a new variant. Okay, so this is very interesting. On an optimistic note, is Omicron a variant evolved to seasonal respiratory virus? The variant carries a portion of genetic material which is similar to segments seen in one of the types of coronaviruses, which just causes common cold. Okay? So it is quite similar to a coronavirus causes common cold, and these experts, they have predicted that CoV2 might end up turning into a milder form of a disease, which could happen to be one of the seasonal respiratory viruses. So this happens to be a pure speculation. We have to wait and watch. We need more data to end up with such predictions. Nevertheless, in the past, we have seen that COVID has thrown several curveballs. That means we cannot expect what exactly we are up to. So there are different tests. Among them, the real-time PCR happens to be the gold standard. We see that 2 or more than 2 genes are used for the real-time PCR detection. So it's unlikely that we might miss the detection of the SARS-CoV-2. The PCR detection does continue to detect, mainly because of multiple targets being used. Several labs have reported S gene dropout or S failure in some strains. And this morning, I also hear about Omicron variants with S gene being intact. So that may not be the way you differentiate between the variants. And it has to be confirmed whenever we speculate Omicron variants. It has to be confirmed by sequencing. And studies are ongoing to determine whether there is any impact on other types of tests, mainly the rapid antigen detection tests, if the S gene is involved. Effectiveness of current treatments, corticosteroids and interleukin-6 receptor blocker, which happens to be mainly the monoclonal antibody, is still effective managing patients with severe COVID-19, even if it is Omicron variant. Since the changes in RBD are very few, Omicron variant will remain susceptible to some of the monoclonal antibody treatments, though not all kind of monoclonal antibodies. So we need further data to prove this. Among the 4 types of COVID-19 vaccines in the future, the mRNA vaccine may be better off, mainly because it is the production is faster and it's easier to tweak the mRNA vaccine according to the variant in circulation. So will existing COVID-19 vaccines work for Omicron variants? We have seen that if it is 2 doses, there is significant 40% reduction in neutralizing antibody of patients, talking in terms of mRNA vaccine. Whereas if 3rd dose, neutralizing antibody titers by 25-fold. So we should always promote booster doses, and some countries have thought of not going for booster doses. So those countries have to rethink about the strategy of vaccination. However, like earlier, there could be breakthrough infections. Breakthrough infections is ones which are seen in fully vaccinated individuals. We have seen that earlier, even twice or thrice, people have got infected with the SARS-CoV-2. However, fully vaccinated individuals, though there are breakthrough infections, they are protected against severe illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. Final slide, take-home message. So the best public health measure happens to be slowing the transmission and hence reducing the likelihood of new variants emerging. You don't panic and keep calm. I would say do not be complacent. Get your booster dose when called for and carry on. And optimistic note is we prefer to be optimistic. COVID-19 could evolve into a mild flu-like disease rather than a killer virus, because it's beneficial for the virus to be more transmissible without causing too much of harm to the host. So regardless of which variant is currently circulating, we need to get vaccinated and booster dose whenever it's available and scheduled. We must take it. We must wear a mask while in public or around those who are more vulnerable. Social distancing in indoor public spaces, avoiding indoor crowds, and also take the seasonal flu shots whenever it's available, because even that can suppress the immunity whenever you have seasonal flu. These are my references.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gottfried. Thank you so much. As always, a talk with some very good take-home messages. And the one take-home message that I am especially referring to is don't panic and get your booster. Now, I say this because only yesterday I got my 2nd booster. So you can see, Dr. Gottfried, that I am anticipating your advice and going ahead and implementing it. Thank you so much. Now,
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, when COVID struck in January of 2020, one of the businesses that took a major hit was global travel. Now, in 2021, post-vaccination, travel has opened up. And I have had the misfortune of traveling once during this 2-year period, traveling once to India. And amongst the other difficulties, undergo the same COVID test at least 3 times prior to during a 48-hour period, including one just before boarding, one immediately after reaching Dubai, and the third one, of course, in RAC Hospital before joining duty. In addition, we are talking about the travails of travel. In addition, I had to report 6 hours ahead for a 3-hour brief international flight. But I am so grateful that I am not a global traveler. Now we have with us today 2 speakers, and I'm going to refer now to the first of our 2 speakers, who is truly, now I am referring to Dr. Rahul Ali. And Dr. Rahul is a Senior Director Global Programming at one site. And now this is a US-based organization which covers more than 52 million people in 53 countries. And we are talking about individuals with who require urgent vision care solutions in communities. Rahul brings with him, he is an option for public health and community service. He completed his MBBS in ophthalmology from the Christian Medical College and then went on to Ludhiana to do his MA and did his studies in Johns Hopkins. Not only did he complete a master's in public health, but also an MBA from Johns Hopkins in the United States. Now, as I mentioned, prior to joining one site, of a suitcase. Now, I'd like to request Dr. Rahul to share his insights, to let us know the reasons for his travel during these difficult times, the locations to which he might have traveled, and to give us a little insight. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Rahul Ali.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for that glowing introduction. Dr. Wilku, thank you so much. Dr. Menezes, thank you so much for a very enlightening talk, truly informative and puts a lot of things into perspective. So I'm gonna take a couple of minutes to just talk to you about my personal journey through COVID and how that affects travel during this time. Well, my first trip during COVID was actually before COVID really took off majorly, and that was in March 2022. And that was just before the world came to a grinding halt and everything kind of stopped us in our tracks. And That was my first flight. PPE goes, at that time, social distancing was advised, but it was very difficult to implement it at the airport. And especially when it comes to getting people getting in lines and being in a rush to get to wherever they have to get to. So that was there. And soon after landing in March last year, that's where flights just kind of stopped globally everywhere. And in Feb this year, there was an article from the World Economic Forum and the International Air Transport Association, which basically said that compared to 2019, the 2020 numbers, global passenger traffic reduced by 65.9%. International passenger demand dropped by 75.6% and domestic by 48%. So you can just imagine what that meant. I'm just going to share my screen for a second and show you guys a couple of slides. One second, sorry. Apologies for the technical glitch. So here you can see the numbers of air passengers in millions was continuously growing from 2004 all the way till kind of COVID undid it. And it just dropped precipitously in 2020. If you look at the global passenger traffic doing really well in 19, and then Q1, Q2, 2020, April onwards, it came to a fraction of what it was. 2021, it's picked up a little bit, but even by the end of 2022, they're not projecting recovery anywhere close to complete or pre-COVID times. If you look at the finances, again, doing really well in 19, crashes in 22, has started picking up, but still not projecting a full recovery anywhere. So clearly that shows that there's a lot of negative effect that's happened. But that said, I think what I would like to highlight here is what it actually feels like when you are traveling. So over time, COVID finally picked up again. Sorry, COVID has picked up, yes, that's true, not in a good way. But flights and air travel also picked up in the meantime. So my next trip was in August 2021 to Kigali in Rwanda. And that was the first time I was flying after COVID had kind of somewhat become a way of life for all of us. And since it was my first flight post-COVID, I was fully in my gown, had my gloves on, had my N95 mask on. I do wear glasses, so I didn't really put on a face shield. I had my sanitizer all over the place. And when I got to Dubai airport, I found that I was one of the very, very few people who looked like he was going into the hospital. Everybody else, all they had on was a mask. On the flight, because I looked like an air steward, because I was flight crew and me in gloves and gowns. That said, it still made me feel very safe. We had a PCR test before departure, like Professor Kennedy alluded to. We had a PCR test on arrival. As far as social distancing goes, I must say the flight was 100% full from here to Kigali. So that was a bit of a shock to me when I got on the flight, but then you have to go where you have to go. We got a PCR test done in Kigali, went to the hotel room, and there I actually felt very safe because you were not allowed out of your room until your PCR test came back the next day or that evening, depending on when you landed. You were only allowed to order room service. They came and left it outside your door, and then you picked it up and brought your food in. But what also made me feel good was everybody, all guests and all hotel staff had their masks on all the time. Social distancing was complied with. Sanitizer was available around every corner in the hotel. And at that time, we were having our Africa Summit meeting. So we had about 40, 45 guests there. But we had this huge auditorium just to ourselves, socially distanced. And during the coffee breaks, the hotel staff would come and tell us to not stand so close to each other and disperse the crowds. So that was really good. The one point of concern, though, was the food service was buffet style. And I don't know if any of you have seen this. There was a really interesting study done way back in April last year, where they actually put fluorescent dye on one individual's hand. He was like the index case. And then they let everybody go through and serve themselves and sit down to eat. And then they put the lights off to see how much that had spread. And all the serving spoons in that entire buffet lineup had fluorescent dye on them, everybody's hands and some people's noses and faces. So I was acutely aware of the fact that buffets are spreaders, but that was the only way you could get food because that's how it was served. So we went with it. What I did personally at that time was as soon as I'd served myself, I would sanitize my hands and then unwrap the serviette and take my cutlery out. But that said, before departure, got our PCR test done again. On landing in Sharjah, again got a PCR test, came home. PCR tests were negative, but I think Dr. Menezes might agree with me, they're not 100% accurate all the time. You do have false negatives. And when you come home from a trip abroad, you're always worried, am I going to give it to my kids, my spouse, my parents, whoever else is in the house? So although I tested negative twice in 48 hours, it was still a bit of a worry mentally and emotionally because you don't want to be the cause for anybody else in the family getting it. Well, luckily, nothing happened. It was all safe. Everybody was fine. And from August onwards, it was all good until October when I had to travel again. Interestingly, in September, I was supposed to go to the US, to Ohio. And I think 2 days before leaving, that trip got canceled because case numbers in the US, in Ohio specifically, were going up. And they had actually run out of rapid testing kits, which were a requirement for all of us to test ourselves the day before our meeting started. And we wouldn't have been able to do that. So we actually called off that global meet. Cutting to October, I left for the US on the 30th, went from here to Chicago and then on from there to Cincinnati. This time I lost my gown. I didn't have my face shield on. I didn't have any gloves on, but I had a good, well-fitting N95 mask and a lot of sanitizer. Got my PCR test done before departing, and you have to fill out a US government declaration. The good thing about Emirates is they do give you a COVID kit. When you're on the flight, you get a little mask and a bottle of sanitizer. And luckily, I had one empty seat beside me and I was in the aisle. So maybe not from a public health or scientific perspective, but emotionally, mentally, I did feel a little bit distanced and better. When we landed in the US, it was quite interesting. I mean, living in the UAE, you expect a lot of testing and questioning to happen when you arrive and you get tested and you get quarantined. And I mean, we've all heard stories of people landing in Abu Dhabi, you get tested, you get bused to the humanitarian city, and you're there till your test comes back. And then you get a little vote on you for 14 days. Getting into the US was really easy. Nobody asked any questions. It was like immigration as normal. And you got in your Uber and you went to the hotel. At the hotel, it was very interesting. Most people actually did not have a mask on. It was a small town, and it was quite surprising to me. I still get my mask on because I do believe in you got to keep yourself safe regardless of whatever anybody else is doing. But it took a little bit of getting used to not seeing people in masks in public places. The good thing though is if you took an Uber in the US or if you took any domestic flights or if you're at the airports, everybody had to have a mask on. So that was quite reassuring. The other good thing is across all the airports that I have traveled through, sanitizer was freely available. All the seating was socially distanced until you got in line and got on the plane, that is. But overall, it was just it was a bit of a challenge getting used to the lack of social distancing while flying. I must say, on the way back from DC, from Washington to Dubai, I did get a full row to myself. So I had 4 seats to sleep on, which was really wonderful. But overall, in the US, I think in public places, COVID protocols were followed to the larger extent, but I still find it difficult to rationalize how social distancing is not important once you get onto the flight. I totally understand the economics of the airline industry, but it's still, from a public health perspective where I come from, it's always a challenge to reconcile for yourself. Landed in Dubai. Luckily, US is not a red country, so I didn't have to get tested, and I just came home. And then the next day, I actually went to Malawi. And I'm so happy I did that trip in November and wasn't trying to do it now because I wouldn't have been able to. Went from here to Nairobi to Malawi. Again, only the flight crew was in gloves and gowns. I just had a mask on like most people. Social distancing, same status quo. It kind of goes out the window once you get onto the plane. In Malawi, we only had to show proof of vaccination, and we didn't have to get tested as such. All the meetings we had were in masks. We did have to do a PCR before departure. And I'm just lucky to have gotten home before Omicron kind of let loose in the southern part of the African continent. So overall, I mean, if I had to wrap it up, I think flying has almost gone back to normal with a few changes in terms of PPE and stuff, and the new normal with a few surprises. Every so often a new variant comes in and countries start shutting themselves down. I think it's very, very important to do what you can. Definitely wear a mask, a good fitting N95 without a valve at all times. If you want to, gloves and a gown, although as per current PPE guidelines, that's not really required. Hand hygiene, very important. Wash your hands with soap, sanitizer. And I think one of the good things about having a mask on is it makes sure you don't touch your nose or your mouth, which has been a source of spread. Social distancing, good. Wherever you can, you must follow that. I think part of flying and part of taking care of yourself is being vaccinated. Please ensure you are fully vaccinated. Like Dr. Menza said, boosters as required. Testing before, and please, wherever you're going to, please make sure you have understood and read the local requirements. From time to time, the timing of the test you take before departure changes. Sometimes it's 72 hours before departure, sometimes it's 72 hours before arrival. So please be careful about what the local rules are. There are various apps which you need to download, various tests which you need to do. And then something which worries me is insurance covered? And what is the state of local health facilities? What happens if you get COVID while you are there? What happens if the rules change when you are in the destination country? What happens if UAE changes its rules and you can't get back? So there are a lot of ifs and buts. So please fly only if you have to. Do what you can to keep yourself and everybody around you safe, and hope and pray that this ends as soon as possible. Thanks.
Dr. Rahul, thank you ever so much. And you are absolutely right. What happens if the UAE changes its rules while we are out of the UAE? You're absolutely right. That is a nightmare. I've been out on one occasion and I was very worried about whether or not I would be allowed back in because of a change of rules. I also know a friend who was traveling who actually got COVID in that particular location or destination which she was traveling, and had to remain for 14 days. So to that extent, insurance is so important. Like you, I've always had a difficult time trying to rationalize a full flight. Of course, the air hostess mentioned to me that the reason why the full flight is because everyone on the flight is already vaccinated and tested. Thank you so much, Dr. Rahul. Now we have our second speaker. Our second speaker, Dr. Salman Abdul Bari, who is also the head of emergency in RAC Hospital. He did his MBBS and his ECFMG from the United States, where he still travels. Now, Dr. Salman, with whom I have lunch often enough, has 10 years of multinational clinical experience in the US and the UAE in critical care, emergency medicine, and also internal medicine. He has worked in Hyderabad and also in the United States. He is currently leading the COVID task force in our own RAC Hospital, Ras Al Khaimah. So Dr. Salman, it's with you now. The reasons why you travel, I do know that you have traveled to India. I do know that you travel to the United States. The reasons for your travel, how often have you traveled in the last few months? And what are your insights? Ladies and gentlemen, I present our head of emergency from the RAC Hospital, Dr. Salman.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Wilku and Professor Kennedy for giving me this opportunity to speak and be a part of the COVID webinar. It's truly an honor to be among such distinguished speakers today, Dr. Godfred and Dr. Rahul. It was a pleasure listening to both of you. From hand sanitizers in hotel lobbies to cabin crew in masks, localized lockdowns to contact tracing apps, COVID-19 has truly transformed the world of travel. Amid closed borders and canceled flights, travel came to a virtual standstill with the United Nations World Tourism Organization declaring 100% of global destinations implementing travel restrictions at the peak of pandemic. It was advised to avoid travel unless it was absolutely necessary. And even when one chose to travel, you had to follow several guidelines that were to be met before you could travel. I had to travel at the peak of pandemic in August 2020. It was a medical emergency. My parents, both my mom and dad, had acquired COVID-19 infection. And somebody like me who was fighting on the front lines every single day, taking care of COVID patients, swabbing more than 500 patients a day, and managing them in the emergency, it was my biggest nightmare to hear about my parents getting infected. My beloved aunt had passed away 3 days ago with COVID infection, and my parents obviously visited her, and that's where they acquired the infection. Initially, it was flu-like symptoms. On the 11th day, their saturation started falling down, and they both had to be rushed to the emergency and admitted to the ICU. As the eldest son and as a doctor who's fighting on the front lines, it was my responsibility to be there for them and with them. There were no flights at that time. There were just repatriation flights flying from Dubai and Ras Al Khaimah, taking people who had lost their jobs back to their home country. I was lucky to get a last minute. There was a no-show. One of the passengers didn't show up and I got a last minute ticket. I was lucky that I had a COVID-19 negative PCR test the night before because we were doing weekly PCR tests. I still had to do a rapid antigen test at the airport before boarding the flight, get into my PPE kit, which I was anyways doing every single day at work, a full gown, face shield, double mask, and get on board the flight. For me at that moment, it was just getting on the flight and reaching Hyderabad. And I was lucky that I could get that flight. On reaching Hyderabad at that time, there was mandatory institutional quarantine, but because I was on a medical emergency, I was exempted, but I had to surrender my passport and other documents to be able to leave the airport and go and see my parents at the hospital. That's a totally different story of what happened in those 2 weeks, but I'm glad my parents fought the infection and recovered and got back home in 2 weeks. Then again, the same story started. I had to look around for my passport first. I had surrendered it when I came, but I had to figure out where it was after 2 weeks when I had to get back to work. After multiple approvals, I got my passport and other documents back. Then I had to apply for the ICA approval from the government of UAE, which I got because I was a doctor. Thousands and hundreds and thousands of people were stuck at that time in India, although having valid residences and jobs. But I got the approval because I was working on the front lines as a doctor. I got my negative PCR test done and got onto a special flight that was taking people back to work in UAE. On reaching UAE, I had to do a COVID test at the Sharjah airport, come back and quarantine. I had left my wife behind at my relative's place, and I didn't want her to come back home till I got my negative reports. I came back, did a COVID test again at the hospital, and I waited for both negative reports till I came back home and till I asked my wife to come back home. I was still asked to quarantine for 3 days at home and repeat a test after 72 hours, which I did. And that was my experience of traveling in the peak of pandemic to India and coming back. August 2021, this year, I traveled again to Chicago, Illinois in the US. It was for immigration, to meet my in-laws, and I also attend a close family wedding. COVID-19 had become pretty normal. People were well aware of the norms and protocols at this point. We were also less stressful because we were vaccinated. We were traveling from a country where the majority of the population had already received their vaccine. We had our negative PCR tests. And most importantly, we had 4 seats to ourselves in the flight. So we didn't have to worry about the social distancing. And Emirates was maintaining excellent hygiene and sanitization procedures. Mandatory face mask was a concern, wearing a face mask for 14 and a half hours from Dubai to Chicago. But we were doing that, and it was important. Since we were traveling from Dubai, we didn't have to test at Chicago airport. And the scenes were completely different at the Chicago airport, very much relaxed. A lot of people not with the face mask on, which was unusual. My younger brother came to receive me at the airport, and he was not wearing a mask either, and I was surprised. And that were the scenes in public places in the US this year. After spending 2 weeks in Chicago, we came back. We had to have a negative PCR test in the US before coming to Dubai. But in Dubai, we were not tested. But of course, when we came back to the hospital, we had to test, and we could only join back to work with a negative PCR test. That was my experience. 2 contrast experiences in August 2020 last year in the peak of pandemic, and 2021 August this year to the US. Much relaxed, much less stressful. My advice would be that please strictly double mask when you travel, I feel. And the importance of changing your mask during travel is something very important. That is my advice. Please carry extra masks with you and change your mask during travel. And make sure you follow strict hand hygiene procedures. And as Dr. Gottfried said, be vaccinated, get your booster shots, because it helps and it's made a difference. We are in UAE where more than 92% of the population is vaccinated, and the number of cases are extremely low. They are below 100, although the world is fighting with Omicron today. I would like to finish by saying that just as the world began to take a sigh of relief, we had an unexpected visitor knocking at our door, Mr. Omicron. So maybe coexisting with this virus is the new normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. Thank you. It started off as being a very emotional presentation. I am truly glad that your parents are well. I want to thank you for being a frontline warrior in our battle against COVID. Thank you so much. And also, I recall being at a function not more than a week or so back, in which some of our frontline warriors in RAC Hospital were receiving certificates of appreciation based on the feedback by their patients. And I want you to know, Dr. Salman, that I clapped especially enthusiastically for you when you went up to receive your certificate of appreciation. Thank you once more for being a frontline warrior. It's people like you that keep us safe. Thank you so much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I floor to my colleague, really the prime mover in this entire series of COVID Beat webinars. I cede the floor to Dr. Wilku, who would ask a few insightful questions. Dr. Wilku, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. First of all, thank you, Dr. Godfrey, Dr. Rahul, Dr. Salman, for putting up all the information beautifully and so simple to understand. And especially Dr. Godfrey, when you spoke about the technical aspects of all the variants, but it was simply placed. So it was easy to understand for a layman person also. Thank you so much. So we have received many questions, and many of the questions, Dr. Godfrey, you have already answered it. Still, I will take as a query. Mr. Harshad Singh is asking, can two variants infect at the same time? Because he has another question. He had COVID infection last year, and can he be infected with a new variant? I think you can club both the answers together. First, I would like Dr. Godfrey, you to answer, and then I would like Dr. Salman to put his views, because he's also interacting with the patients in ER. Dr. Godfrey, please.
Yeah, so thank you for a very interesting question regarding two variants infecting at a time. We could call it as a co-infection. There have been rarely few cases to cite a reference. It was a Belgian woman who was infected with the alpha and beta. So it happens to be among individuals who are not vaccinated and elderly. So these two are the predisposing factors, not vaccinated and elderly. So she was, and when it is a co-infection with two different variants, it happens to be two milder variants rather than one severe variant and one mild variant. It happens to be two milder variants. So it was alpha and beta, but since she was not vaccinated and she did have underlying conditions, she did succumb to the infection. So yes, it is possible, but it is very, very rare. So that is the first part of the question. Second one was about if you are infected, how long it might take to get infected second time. That people getting infected after 6 months, when it's a second infection, reinfection. So people have got infected even twice or thrice in spite of being fully vaccinated or 2 doses of vaccine followed by an incidence of infection. Yes, it is possible, but it is very rare. And when it happens, it takes at least 6 months or even beyond. Mostly it's 1 year later, you can have reinfection. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah. Dr. Salman, your inputs on this.
Yes, Dr. Velko, we've seen not many cases, very few cases that have had reinfection. Young patients vaccinated, but with mild symptoms, who've had reinfection with different variants. But I have not encountered any patients with with a co-infection. So that's been the case in our emergency. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could add, that's crucial, I guess. So it has to be the genomic study to, to get an evidence that it is two variants at a time. So we cannot discern out of any other test. It has to be the sequencing, genomic studies to come
Yeah.
out with, evidence. And regarding the reinfection, we have seen, as Dr. Dr. said recently now, about reinfection. It is usually mild infection. It is never severe infection, because a person might be still having the neutralizing antibodies, first line defense, followed by CMI, second line defense. So mostly it is, or whatever we have seen so far has been mild cases, never severe cases.
Yeah. Thank you, Doc. Mr. Bharat is asking, is there any specific vaccine for a specific variant? Because this is a very multiple times we are coming across these questions. People used to ask whenever we are doing some counseling or talking to some patients. It's very frequently asked, is there any specific vaccine for a specific variant?
Yeah, if I could answer that,
Yeah, sure.
followed by Dr. Salman could add. Yeah, regarding variant-specific vaccine, as of now, we do not have it. And whatever was available among the vaccines, the most preferred vaccine, considering that virus is mutating and we have newer variants, mRNA vaccine seems to be the best one, mainly because the production is faster and you can tweak it the way you want in a much lesser time. Regarding the variant-specific vaccine, just 4 days ago, there has been sort of a write-up based on the lab study where nanoparticle-based mRNA vaccines were tried out for variant-specific SARS-CoV-2, and the lab details, the lab data has been quite promising. So it is possible, and it has to be done in the future, but we need better technology, which is a sort of nanoscience based, nanoparticle based mRNA vaccines.
Yeah, thank Doc. Dr. Salman, you can also.
Well, as Dr. Gottfried said, there is no specific vaccine for the variant. But most importantly, as again he said, it's important to get a booster shot because it's proven and it's being still understudied that booster shots, definitely help in, taking care of the variants. Although you might still have an infection, but it will be very mild.
Yeah, thank you. There is one interesting question which I would like to request Dr. Rahul to answer this. What should be the preventive measures during the travel in hotspots? Because you have been traveling frequently to hotspot areas. So Dr. Rahul, just give your inputs.
Sure. I think it's not rocket science. It's something which I think all of us have heard enough times ad nauseum from every corner about anybody giving advice. I think first of all, please be vaccinated so that you're safe. Face protection, your masks, a good fitting mask, change your mask as often as you need to, hand sanitizer, wash your hands, and social distance. These are things, your mask, hand hygiene, and social distancing. Avoid crowded places. If you are in a group, try to make sure you're close to a window, keep windows open. It should be a well-ventilated place. When you're traveling, again, by road, if you're in a taxi, keep the windows open. Keep the windows down. It's very important to keep your thing well ventilated. If you are traveling, if there are 4 people, take 2 taxis. Take 2 per taxi. Don't crowd up. So I think it's the same usual thing, social distancing, hand hygiene, and masks. I think that's what's going to keep us all safe, and definitely stay vaccinated.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rahul. Mr. or Miss, I don't just recall. Lauren is asking, how many patients with COVID-19 we have treated in RAC hospital? It's a question, but second part, I would like Dr. Salman to answer this part. What is the majority of the patients representing who are requiring IC care?
more than 90% of the patients that we've seen since the pandemic has started have been mild infections. We've treated thousands of patients in the emergency and cold and flu clinic that we've started since the pandemic began. And most of them have been very mild. I could say less than 5% of the cases required ICU admissions, or they ended up being in ICU. And again, the mortality rate has been very, very low as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have covered the questions and a few other questions which are replicated. So we'll answer that through the mail. So Professor Kennedy, over to you.
It's my pleasant duty to thank all our speakers. It's been an enlightening session. We spoke about the variants. We also spoke about the travails of global travel, and it was very lucidly presented. I'd like to end by putting up a slide that we have, which talks about the COVID program that we share in terms of rehab. Now, the current program, the webinars, is part of our virtual program in which we conduct webinars every 2 weeks. But we also have a physical program here in RAC Hospital where we have a doctor's consult, diet counseling, a psychiatry session, a physiotherapy session, and we would be more than happy to have as many of our colleagues from Russell Khaimer who need our services to come in and utilize them at absolutely no cost. This is part of our social service. I'd like to thank our speakers for coming in to the program today. I'd like to thank all our colleagues and departments that helped us to put this show up on the road. That would be IT, it would be Arabian Wellness, and specifically Dr. Wilku Sadeh and Saloni and Libin from IT. I'd like to thank them all. And most importantly, thank you to our participants and our listeners. And with that, good day, keep well and keep safe. We will see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.